We talk about all of this, former federal prosecutor Joseph Moreno, Washington Post columnist Max Boot, and Melanie Zadona, congressional reporter for Politico. Let's start first with what we're learning about the president's legal team. So, Max, the addition here of Ken Starr, Robert Ray, and Alan Dershowitz. Specifically, when we look at Alan Dershowitz, who we understand will be taking on the constitutional argument here. How do you see that playing out, and him as a choice?
Well, it's an odd choice. I mean, I think the combination of Dershowitz and Starr kind of reuniting the so-called all-star team that defended Jeffrey Epstein on sex crime charges in Florida, and they both bring a lot of baggage to the case. I would actually focus more on Ken Starr than I would on Dershowitz in this case, because remember, Ken Starr in 1999 was saying that Bill Clinton should be impeached for lying about sex, and now he's saying that Donald Trump should not be impeached for misusing military aid to blackmail a foreign country into helping him politically, which is a far more serious offense. And remember also, Ken Starr is going to be arguing we don't need any more witnesses. And yet, when he was actually conducting his investigation of Bill Clinton, he interviewed everybody, including Monica Lewinsky's hairdresser, the White House window washers. Everybody talked to him. And now we have not heard from the key players, people like John Bolton, Mick Mulvaney, Secretary of State Pompeo, and others. And so I think there's an imperative here to hear from those people. And the precedent that Ken Starr and the Republicans set in 1998, 1999 actually works against them in this present instance. So this seems to me like another example of Trump just going with big names that he sees on TV without thinking through the implications of those choices.
Joe, would you agree with that there's actually more baggage to these choices than there are benefits in terms of putting together a strategy for the president?
I mean, a strategy has never really been this president's strong suit, right? He seems to be very reactionary. I mean, it's an interesting combination. You have workhorses and you have show horses here, right? You have lawyers who will roll up their sleeves and really defend the case, and then you have lawyers who will be good on television. It's an interesting combination. Whether that skill set outweighs that baggage that you just pointed out, though, yet to be seen, because you're right. There's a lot of historical references here now back to the Clinton years. What went right, what went wrong. And a lot of those comparisons do not bode well for this president.
We watch to see how that plays out. What's also interesting is what we've seen from Mitch McConnell publicly, right? We have seen, Melanie, this unwavering support of the president. And yet, with the new reporting behind the scenes, we're learning a little bit more about how he's listening, what he's doing to make sure that his caucus, in fact, stays united. How is all of this playing out?
He is threading a very thin needle right now. He has a bunch of different competing factions within his own conference that he's trying to deal with. You have the hardliners who are pushing for controversial witnesses like Hunter Biden. They have the moderate, vulnerable Republicans who are up for re-election like Susan Collins. Then there's the institutionalists who want a very serious and somber proceeding. And so you're seeing little bones that he's throwing to each members of these. He had a meeting with Ted Cruz and Rand Paul where he heard them out about the idea of hauling in witnesses like Hunter Biden, but then also behind the scenes, he's allowing Susan Collins and others to have this at least option to turn to the question of witnesses further down in the trial. I would just point out, though, that even though a number of these Republicans are supporting the up or down motion on whether to call witnesses, that doesn't mean they're all going to agree on the same witnesses. And you still need four of them to come together on a single specific person. And so far, the only one who said, I want to hear from John Bolton is Mitt Romney.
Which is an interesting point and important to point that out. As we look at this, too, there's, of course, this new information from Lev Parnas. And a lot of Democrats really jumping all over it, pointing to this, saying this is a perfect example of why we need to allow new testimony, why we need to hear from witnesses. But there are, Max, legitimate questions about Parnas's credibility that can't be ignored. Are Democrats lining up behind him too quickly? Or do they have a point there that he could be an important person to talk to?
Well, I'm not sure that Democrats are really lining up to vouch for Lev Parnas's credibility. I mean, like most of the people around Trump and Trump himself, he has very little credibility, but he did see things and he is making charges and he does have documents. I think what Democrats are really saying is not, we believe this guy 100%. What they're saying is, let's put him under oath. Let's get at the truth of this. Let's treat this like an actual trial. When you have people making allegations, let's hear from them. You know, the Republican response is just ridiculous, which is that if they didn't testify in the House, then we can't have them testify in the Senate. I mean, that's like saying somebody's been indicted and there's new evidence that develops before their trial, but you can't present the evidence at trial because it wasn't presented at the indictment. That's not how it works.
Well, but we don't. The bottom line is we don't know exactly how it's going to work yet.
Right.
Because we don't have the rules yet.
Right.
So it could be, Mitch McConnell could very well say this is how it's going to work. This is how I want it to work and get those votes.
Okay, I mean, if McConnell manages to keep witnesses from testifying, this will be the first time in the history of Congress that we've had an impeachment trial without witnesses. That would be a gross miscarriage of justice. And that's why I think you see at least 4 or 5 Republican senators who have signaled that they are open to this because they realize it would be a travesty not to hear from any witnesses.
To Max's point, Joe, what we're hearing from Republicans, their pushback obviously is, well, you should have called them in the House. If you had to deal with legal issues, you should have done that. In terms of subpoenas, in terms of pushback from the White House, when we look at what we know, right, even putting some of this new evidence out, if it is not allowed in, from what you've seen, do Democrats have what they need to make their case at this point in the Senate?
Erica, I think even without this new evidence and new witnesses, Democrats have a solid case, right? I mean, and I think a lot of them have already indicated how they're going to vote because they're comfortable with the evidence that's already on the record. Republicans will have to make a tough choice, right? It's one thing to say, I heard all the evidence and I voted to acquit, basically to not remove the president. It's another to go back to the voters and say, basically, I kept my head in the sand, I refused to hear all the evidence, and I voted to acquit. I think that's a much more difficult sell. And it's not all 53 Republicans. It's those 4 to 6 Republicans that have to worry about the reaction from their constituents.
Those 4 to 6 Republicans, we talk a lot about the Republicans and people watching the Republicans, but Vice President Pence penning this op-ed in the Wall Street Journal where he's calling on Senate Democrats and saying it's time for you to put the party aside. It's time for you to look at the evidence. And he says it would be a profile encouraged for Democrats to vote with Republicans, which is great because this is the same argument that we hear Democrats in many ways making to Republicans, Melanie. But again, we talk a lot about the Republicans. We've talked about some of the people we're looking at. Who are you looking at overall on both sides of the aisle? I mean, who is everyone trying to game at this point?
Well, I'm not sure, first of all, Pence's opinion is going to have much sway with Democrats, considering he is embroiled in the Ukraine scandal. But that being said, some of the Democrats who we are watching, Doug Jones of Alabama, he's one of the most vulnerable Democrats up for re-election next year. Kristen Sinema of Arizona is in a really tight race with Martha McSally. And then there's Joe Manchin of West Virginia, who has crossed party lines before and sided with the president on a number of high-profile issues. So we are keeping an eye on them. But I think the strategy for the White House is to try to make less of a political appeal to them. And as you saw in this op-ed, it's more of a constitutional argument. I think perhaps that is part of the strategy and bring on Alan Dershowitz. They're not just going to focus on things like Hunter Biden and Adam Schiff. They're going to try to make a serious legal argument, as far as we can tell.
It's interesting, too, that we're seeing this because there's this push for, remember what you were sent to Washington to do from both sides. There is a reminder of the oath that senators are taking, the oath they took when they were sworn into office, but also the oath as jurors in the Senate. That's getting a lot of attention. And they should be taken into consideration.
They should be. And unfortunately, you've had comments from Mitch McConnell and Lindsey Graham and others basically saying they're going to vote to acquit no matter what. So they're showing they're not going to take their oaths of office seriously. Now, on the other side, I actually think Democrats are following the evidence because it's just not correct to say that they've been trying to impeach Trump from day one. In fact, there's been a lot of evidence to suggest that impeachment is warranted in the past, and House Speaker Nancy Pelosi never went forward because she didn't think the case was compelling enough. Well, now clearly the case is compelling enough. So what is the actual defense Republicans are going to mount? I think the fact that Alan Dershowitz is in there indicates what the defense is. It's basically a version of the O.J. defense. It's jury nullification, saying ignore the evidence, vote to acquit despite the mountain of evidence. That's essentially the Republican argument. It's ironic that Mike Pence is saying that Democrats should buck their party because their entire argument in the defense of Trump is based on party loyalty, saying Republicans should not vote to impeach no matter how much evidence suggests that Trump did something wrong.
Well, it reminds us, too, of something the president once said, which I'm paraphrasing, but what you're seeing and hearing isn't really happening. Remember, so there are all those moments. Max Boot, Melanie, and Joseph Moreno, thank you all.